Monstrously overwritten.
Preposterously difficult.
It demands nearly superhuman stamina and virtuosity of its soloist.
Some people loathe this work.
The difficulties are absolutely immense.
Was this infamous concerto worth the wait? I have to say yes.
Beyond what should be
A
acceptable.
hymn to immoderation.
The most difficult imaginable.
The piano part was like a sea of black notes.
Others think it's the greatest thing ever written.
Of all the criminally neglected and ignored piano concertos, by far the greatest.
Why not?
These are just a few of the ways that musicians and critics have described what might be the 20th century's most divisive piece, written by one of its most misunderstood composers. It's a piano concerto in C major. This should be one of the most harmless genres, right? A pianist, an orchestra, serving up virtuosity and joy in one of the most delightful keys imaginable. Well, think again. This is no ordinary concerto, no ordinary C major. This is a sprawling 5-movement epic that contains thunderous orchestral writing that would rival Wagner or Mahler, and some of the most frighteningly virtuosic piano writing of all time.
25% of this piece is the most heavily and, if you will, cruelly difficult writing for piano in any known piano concerto.
It's a fever dream of musical references to Mozart, Beethoven, Tchaikovsky, Liszt, and even predictions of composers who would write later like Sibelius and Prokofiev. And yet, this piece was not written by any of them. It's the work of a radically inventive individual. Indeed, this is a whole new world of piano writing. And actually, Aladdin does make an appearance in this piece as well. Not to mention that it features a full male chorus in the final movement. And if you know the piece that I'm talking about, you've probably been exposed to the most legendary recording of it that exists. Is this a masterpiece or a chaotic jumble of borrowed ideas? A groundbreaking leap into the future or a misguided nostalgia trip?
This is Busoni's piano concerto.
Today we're going to get to the bottom of it, movement by movement, trying to understand what makes this concerto so unique and why so many of the world's most fantastic pianists have spent their precious life energy devoted to learning this piece. By the way, some of the pianists who we are going to discuss today are featured on Tonebase Premium. Tonebase Premium is a subscription platform that gives you access to some of the world's most incredible pianists and piano teachers talking about topics from music theory to technique to specific repertoire.
The word technique, as we all use it, is a misnomer.
It adds an entirely new layer of depth to the content that we produce here on YouTube. They are currently in the final days of their winter sale, and it's an absolutely spectacular time to jump in. It's 40% off all new plans, as well as $300 off the new coaching program, which gives you the opportunity to work one-on-one with a pianist no matter where you are. And if you need a last-minute holiday gift, this is a great choice for the music lover in your life. Check the link in the description below to get started with a 14-day free trial and to take advantage of the winter sale. Now let's get back to business, and the only possible way to start with a piece of this magnitude is from the very beginning. The concerto opens with a traditionally expansive orchestral statement, sweeping melodies that are then accompanied by grandiose chords in the piano.
It really gives you the feeling of a gigantic cathedral standing next to you. It's really incredible. And then it gets free and dark, but always very, very, very noble.
Just as you think you might be able to comprehend the trajectory, things get a little bit strange. The first movement sets the tone for what is to come. This is a concerto that is not afraid to break the rules. As the piano's writing becomes more virtuosic, it also becomes more ornamental.
Like Brahms, he writes immensely difficult things which are really just part of the texture and nobody notices how difficult it is.
Phrases crash into each other with almost no breathing room, and the pianist is basically playing non-stop. And yet, the greatest performances of this piece make the first movement sound effortless. like an unending tapestry of beautiful romantic vocal phrases, in spite of how many notes there are. This brings us to the incredible, legendary performance of Hamelin playing this. In the first movement, he's able to make the gestures incredibly crisp, but there's always still a longer line that unifies them. Based on what we know about Busoni himself, he would have no doubt been incredibly well equipped to play this difficult material when he performed it in 1904. Indeed, Busoni was a frightfully good pianist. I have to be honest that I personally have always struggled a little bit with this piece, even though I'm a huge admirer of Busoni. I remember when I was a conservatory student back in the day that this was the kind of piece that we would pop on at 2 a.m. while searching YouTube and kind of laugh at it. A concerto with a male chorus, and it's 75 minutes long, and it's impossible to play? Ha ha ha! And I mean, it is an absurd piece. I mean, who would write something like this? Well, to be fair, perhaps we can look at Beethoven, whose choral fantasy is also scored for piano and orchestra and chorus together, and could have been a precursor to this work, albeit much, much shorter. It took me years to get into this piece. Every time I would listen to it, I would get rather overwhelmed or distracted and stop halfway through. But I always had the nagging feeling in the back of my mind that there was something really important here that I wanted to understand. And I have to say that now, after spending many, many hours with this work, I am quite obsessed with it. However, it is challenging, both for the listener and for the pianist, and these challenges get started right away in the first movement. In order to understand what makes this piece tick, we need to get a slightly more complex understanding of Busoni and what he was really aiming for. Most pianists are quite familiar with Busoni from his transcriptions of Bach, most notably the incredibly popular Bach-Busoni chaconne. In fact, even during his lifetime, Busoni was so well known for transcriptions that there were multiple occasions when his wife was mistakenly referred to as Mrs. Bach-Busoni.
That's not my name!
The attribution of Busoni to being an expert transcriber was a complicated part of his compositional career, which we will discuss in a moment. But taking away the Bach part, who really was Busoni? Busoni was born in 1866 in a small town in Italy, but his life was defined by an international cosmopolitanism. He studied in his youth in Vienna and Graz and moved around between St. Petersburg, Helsinki, Boston, New York, and Leipzig. But finally, Busoni settled in Berlin, where he continued his work as a virtuoso pianist and composer. He also produced and financed concerts of contemporary music, championing new works by up-and-coming composers of the time such as Bartók, Elgar, Sibelius, and Isai. It was in this series of new music concerts that Busoni premiered his piano concerto, Opus 39, in 1904. It might be difficult to believe that the composer of the crowd-pleasing chaconne that is played in piano competitions around the world was actually a quirky, idealistic individual, but Busoni was an extremely curious character, and he was constantly struggling to reconcile all of the different parts of his identity. He was in love with literature and philosophy, and in his own article, Sketch for a New Aesthetic of Music, written in 1907, he advocated for experiments in composition such as microtonality and electronic music, ideas that were really just on the very margins of the musical lexicon at the time. Though he never really pursued any of those experiments himself, Busoni was certainly interested in breaking the boundaries of genre. We can hear that right away in the second movement of his concerto. This is no ordinary scherzo. We have shifted gears entirely from the grandiosity of the first movement. This is playful, ironic music that is even a bit silly at times. Sometimes the piano is dancing along with the music politely, but other times it's just crashing through the texture like a bowl in a ballroom.
Please go to 11.
Busoni's sense of humor is on full display here.
It's like a ghostly scherzo, very chromatic, very playful, very joyful, and yet harsh and dark.
We've come to the third movement, entitled Pezzo Serioso. It's almost like a little opera within the concerto, with 4 acts of its own. It's truly the emotional crux of the piece and gives the pianist a chance to show off the most intense emotions of the entire work so far. The relationship between the orchestra and the piano is a kind of profound dialogue. Alternates between brooding introspection and fiery melodrama, with a literal storm breaking out in the center of the movement.
It's a very noisy storm. And in those measures, which don't last very long, sometimes the piano has as many as 128 notes.
And that accompaniment is some of the most difficult imaginable.
This movement really demonstrates that Busoni was not at all interested in the conventions of genre. And I think that this is the first obstacle to really being able to enjoy this piece. Musical genres are a tool for communication. They let us know what to listen for and what to expect in a piece of music that we're about to hear. When we see that a piece is a piano concerto, that already gives us an immense amount of information about the instruments that are going to be used, the style of writing that we're going to hear, and even the length of the work. When Busoni calls this piece a concerto and has a movement in the middle that has 4 separate parts and includes a chorus and writes the piece to be longer than an hour, it really goes against all of the expectations that we have about what a concerto should be or what it can be. Even if the musical material itself isn't anything crazily avant-garde, we're not really exactly sure what this piece is or how we should be listening to it.
I find that a lot of people are sort of disoriented when they first hear it because they expect that the traditional piano concerto, which it is not.
However, this friction between expectations and reality is exactly where the art making happens and exactly where Busoni wants us to be. It can be tempting to understand this piece better by calling it a symphonic work or the kind of sketches of some unwritten opera. But let's remember that Busoni wrote symphonic works and wrote operas as well, and he could have just as easily called this that. Instead, he calls this piece a concerto, and by doing so, he invites us as listeners to hear it in the context of the Romantic concerto history. By following this path, Busoni asks us to break our brains a little bit. Remember that we were discussing Busoni's notoriety as a transcriber. Well, he was always playing around with the tropes of history and with what it meant to actually compose something. Although transcription writing was extremely popular in the 19th century, by the 20th century it had gone out of fashion a little bit. Composers were expected to constantly come up with something brand new. And as such, Busoni's notoriety as a skilled transcriber kind of harmed his reputation as a composer. Busoni was intriguingly somewhat old-fashioned and pioneering in this way. He didn't believe that it was possible for a composer to invent something completely individual and completely original. Instead, he thought that composers were more like spiritual ambassadors who facilitated music that was simply floating around us in the ether at all times. As such, Busoni wasn't afraid to engage with music that had already been written, as he believed that music was free. It didn't belong to any one composer or any one time period. It was merely his job to catch the inspiration as it flew by and to communicate that in the music that he wrote. It's quite interesting if we think about it because Busoni's hero, J.S. Bach, was similarly playing around with the tropes of what a concerto was already a few centuries earlier with his Italian concerto.
Form is genre. He wants to show not that he's transcribed a concerto for solo keyboard, but rather that concerto form, the idea of a big ensemble and a soloist and these things can be applied to a solo keyboard piece.
Speaking of Italian, that brings us to the fourth movement of the concerto, all'italiana. The seriousness of the third movement has completely evaporated, instead bringing us to more of Busoni's witty, light-hearted, but also still quite diabolical writing. It's in a movement like this one where the immense brilliance of a pianist like Hamelin is on full display.
It's really dancey and it's splashy and it's virtuosic beyond belief. It's just fantastic. It's absolutely fantastic.
I think the absolute best description of this movement comes from the music critic Alex Ross. And I'm going to read it to you because I just simply couldn't have said it better myself. The score urges the performers to go for broke. Snare drum and tambourine drive the rhythms. Wrong notes intrude on popular vamps. The coda, marked La Stretta, begins as an homage to Rossini and veers towards Dada. Think of Liszt and Chopin on parade floats playing simultaneously. It's profoundly funny, vaguely frightening music, a Nietzschean dance on the edge of a cliff. It also renders Liberace unnecessary.
Only the old ladies like me.
Throughout the span of this whole piece, in which Busoni seems to be moving through hallucinations of previous composers, there is one moment that is unmistakably the work of the master himself. That's the cadenza. It's nearly impossible to imagine any other composer, let alone one in 1904, with the boldness and inventiveness to write something like this. And when a pianist with the skill of someone like Hamelin blasts through the texture with this material, it is quite something to witness. Busoni wants us to listen to this piece as a concerto, as a parable of the individual and the collective. And this piece could have been quite satisfyingly finished with the bold notes in the last measures of the fourth movement. But there is another element which Busoni seems to want us to consider, and that's the individual's relationship to the universe, to God, perhaps, to nature, which brings us to the fifth movement. When we get to this movement, the cantico finale, the pianist finally has a moment to breathe, leaving room for the chorus to finally enter after almost an hour of music. They begin singing text written by the Danish writer Adam Oehlenschläger. And the choice of this text is just another example of how quirky and impossible to classify Busoni really was. Oehlenschläger's text is a retelling of the story of Aladdin. And although he spoke German extremely poorly, he wrote the text in German. And there's tons of grammatical errors and awkward things in the text. Apparently Goethe actually helped him to fix up the German in a new edition, but Busoni loved the original German text. He loved the poor grammar, he thought it gave the text a kind of mystical quality. In the concerto, Busoni uses a scene from Oehlenschläger's story where ancient rocks come to life and begin singing a hymn of transcendence and unity. Whether or not the content of the words is particularly meaningful in the context of the piece is up for debate, but no doubt it creates an extremely spiritual experience between the orchestra, the pianist, and the chorus. It's quite appropriate that one of the most iconic recordings of this piece, with Marc-André Hamelin, was recorded here in Finland with the Lahti Symphony Orchestra. As I mentioned before, Busoni himself lived in Helsinki from the years of 1888 to 1890, where he befriended a young and upcoming composer called Jean Sibelius. Busoni would become Sibelius's mentor and friend in a relationship that lasted decades. In fact, Sibelius once wrote to Busoni,
"I thank you from the bottom of my heart. Without you, the Fifth Symphony would have remained paper, and I, an apparition from the forest."
And Sibelius wasn't the only one to be extremely inspired by Busoni's iconoclastic thinking. He was an inspiration to many pianists and composers who studied with him, including people as varied as Kurt Weill, Edgar Varèse, and Egon Petri. His writings and transcriptions continue to inspire to this very day. And not only that, but this concerto remains a monument of musicianship, a kind of Mount Everest to conquer. Let's return to Hamelin's incredible recording. We're at the fifth movement, and it looks like the man has barely broken a sweat. It makes sense that Hamelin plays this piece so remarkably well. He too is an incredibly creative musician, composer, and iconoclastic thinker, not to mention his incredible technical skill and musical brilliance. Busoni's piano concerto is more than a concerto, and it's not just some silly curiosity. It's a wild, unapologetic vision for what music could be. For those brave enough to tackle it, whether as listeners or as performers, it offers a glimpse into a truly remarkable world, one in which music breaks free of its own boundaries and redefines what is possible.
We owe this determination to explore, all the way from Liszt and Wagner, I think, to expand tonality, and to expand every single other parameter of musical expression.
Thanks so much for joining us today and just scratching the surface of this absolutely phenomenal work. I really feel like it is just one of those pieces that you will constantly be returning to, and once you get into it, it really starts to reveal itself amazingly. I definitely recommend that you all take an hour or so on your holidays and give it a listen. And by the way, if you want to hear more from Marc-André Hamelin or Garrick Ohlsson, some of the most iconic performers of this piece, check out their lessons on Tonebase Premium. These are just two examples of some of the absolutely phenomenal pianists that are featured there. The library on Tonebase Premium really offers a whole new layer of information to the kind of stuff that we talk about here on YouTube. If you're serious about learning more about music, no matter for how long you've been playing the instrument or whether you've touched the instrument at all, there is something for everyone on the premium platform. And if you like the content you see here on YouTube, then you will love what you see on Tonebase Premium. If you want to get started, click the link in the description below. I'm Robert Fleitz from Tonebase. Have a happy new year, and I'll see you in 2025. Or wherever you are in the future or past.
Do you trust me?